2 matches, 2 nights, 1 tournament that promised to be the greatest football event in history, and already, within the first 36 hours of the 2026 World Cup, the images and moments and controversies that have surrounded this competition before a single ball was kicked have begun to play out in real time, in full view, in front of the world. Not all of it bad, not all of it good, but all of it significant, and all of it telling a story that the governing body's promotional communications are no longer capable of containing. The opening match at the Azteca gave us 3 red cards, the most in any single World Cup match in history, equaling the Battle of Nuremberg 20 years on. A 35-year-old man who survived a skull fracture and recently lost his father, scoring his first World Cup goal and pointing to the sky through his tears. A referee's microphone announcement that nobody could understand going instantly viral. A South African team that was stranded on a runway 11 days before this match, navigating visa crises and administrative failures, finishing the game with 9 men and still competing with everything they had. And then, fewer than 4 hours later at the Guadalajara Stadium in Mexico, the second match of the tournament told a different but equally revealing story. South Korea 2, Czechia 1. A genuine comeback, a genuinely dramatic result. But sitting in the stands to watch it, FIFA's own president, Gianni Infantino, was a man looking at something his promotional language had not prepared anyone for. Hundreds of empty seats, sections in the middle of the stands visibly unoccupied. Both teams jeered as they left the field at halftime. An atmosphere that reporters described, without exaggeration, as reflecting the gap between what had been promised and what had arrived. So what's really happening here, and what do the first 2 matches of this tournament tell us about the World Cup that has just begun? Let's go through it carefully, starting with the numbers, because the numbers are where the story of those empty seats in Guadalajara becomes impossible to dismiss with a statement about unprecedented demand. The Guadalajara Stadium holds 45,664 people. The announced attendance for South Korea against Czechia was 44,985. On paper, that is a near-capacity crowd. In practice, the images told a different story entirely. Sections in the middle of the stands had many unoccupied seats. Empty seats were scattered across the stadium. The visual impression, the one that spread across social media and television broadcasts within minutes, was not of a tournament at capacity. It was of a World Cup match being played in a stadium that was visibly, demonstrably not full, despite an official announcement suggesting otherwise. That gap between the announced number and the visible empty seats is itself a story. It is the story of a governing body that has been managing the perception of demand for this tournament across months, through ticket inventory disappearing from official platforms without explanation, through a president claiming 500 million ticket requests, through promotional language about unprecedented interest colliding with hotel occupancy surveys and aviation booking data that have consistently told the different story. And now, in the second match of the tournament, in front of its own president, the gap between the announced number and the visible empty seats was playing out on live television for the entire world to see. Both teams were jeered at halftime. That detail is as significant as the empty seats. Because jeering at halftime is not a response to poor results. The score was 0-0, so neither team had yet given the crowd a result to react to. It was a response to a performance, to football that had not, in the first 45 minutes, justified the cost and the effort of being there. South Korea had 11 shot attempts without confirming. Czechia had 2. The game was, by most assessments, technically poor in its opening half, and the crowd, or the portion of it that was actually in the stadium, let both teams know. The second half produced something much better. Czechia went ahead through captain Ladislav Krejci after a long throw-in, heading the ball into the net in the 59th minute. Then South Korea responded with exactly the quality that the first half had withheld. Hwang In-bom faked a shot, moved past 2 Czech defenders with a move of genuine skill, and scored. Then, with 10 minutes remaining, he crossed from the right flank and Oh Hyun-gyu headed home the winner. A comeback. Drama. the kind of second half that redeems the first. South Korea's coach said winning without giving up made him happy, and that the positive thing was what his team showed in those final 30 minutes. And Gianni Infantino, sitting in those stands, watching those hundreds of empty seats, and then watching South Korea score twice to win, was there for all of it. FIFA's president, who told people to chill and relax about Omar Artan, who described this tournament as a total party, who cited 500 million ticket requests as evidence of demand that had never been seen before in football history, was physically present at a World Cup match with visible empty sections in a near-capacity stadium while both teams were being jeered off the pitch at halftime. That is not a narrative constructed around him. That is where he was and what he saw.
Now, here's where things get more complex, because the empty seats in Guadalajara are the most visible current expression of a problem that has been building across months, and that the first two matches have now made impossible to attribute to anything other than the cumulative consequences of specific decisions. The pricing model that raised average ticket costs by 35% across 95 of the 104 matches. The dynamic pricing system that created an environment in which supporters who looked at prices in October found them a third higher when they returned in April. The 39 countries subject to entry restrictions whose supporters face barriers to attending matches. The 4 qualifying nations whose supporters cannot follow their teams on American soil. But there is an additional dimension to the empty seat story in Guadalajara that has received less attention than it deserves, because South Korea's supporters, one of the most passionate and organized fan travel communities in world football, face their own version of the access problem at this tournament. Korean fans planning to travel to the United States encountered the same visa processes and entry uncertainties that have deterred supporters from across the world, and the match that most of them would have prioritized above all others, Son Heung-min in a World Cup group stage fixture, took place not at a stadium with easy connections from a major Korean community hub, but in Guadalajara, Mexico, a city that requires its own travel logistics, even for supporters who have navigated the American visa process. Son Heung-min himself is worth dwelling on. He is one of the most recognizable Asian footballers in the world, a Tottenham captain, a Champions League winner, a player whose career arc has brought him to this World Cup carrying more expectation than any previous Korean tournament. He had 2 genuine chances in that first half and failed to convert either of them, stopped twice by an excellent performance from Mate Kovar in the Czech goal. The captain of South Korea at the World Cup he has been building toward for years, unable to score in a first half that his own crowd jeered at its conclusion. That is the human face of the empty seat problem. The players feel a lifeless atmosphere. The atmosphere becomes the story alongside the football. Here is the interesting part, because the contrast between the Azteca on opening night and the Guadalajara Stadium just hours later tells you something important about the nature of the attendance problem at this tournament. The Azteca was full, 83,000 people. The noise was extraordinary. The ceremony was spectacular. The match was chaotic and emotional, and produced a moment, Raúl Jiménez's tears, his first World Cup goal at 35, pointing to the sky for his father, that will be remembered long after the red cards have become footnotes. Mexico's opening night delivered exactly what the World Cup is supposed to deliver. The difference between the Azteca and the Guadalajara Stadium is not simply about which teams were playing, it is about the football culture surrounding the venue. The Azteca is in Mexico City. Over 70% of Mexico's population identifies as a football supporter. The host nation's home opening match in a stadium whose history breathes through every match played there, in a city where the World Cup has been part of the cultural conversation for months. The conditions for a full electric stadium were present in every way. Guadalajara, by contrast, was hosting South Korea against Czechia, 2 nations whose traveling supporter communities face specific and documented barriers. The South Korean diaspora in Mexico is smaller than in the United States. Czech supporters face the same European travel deterrents that have reduced continental bookings to American host cities, and the match was played late at night local time, 10 o'clock in the evening in Guadalajara, which itself affects the casual attendance that fills the remaining seats when the committed travelers can't fill them alone.
All of this matters because the governing body's commercial model assumes that the tournament itself generates enough demand to fill its stadiums, regardless of the specific barriers facing any individual supporter community. That assumption worked at the Azteca. It didn't fully work in Guadalajara. And the question that the next 5 weeks of group stage football will answer is whether the Azteca model or the Guadalajara model is more representative of what this tournament actually looks like when the football moves beyond the host nation's home fixtures. Think about what it meant for FIFA's president to be sitting in that stadium, not as a symbolic point about irony, but as a practical observation about institutional awareness. He was there. He saw the empty sections. He heard both teams jeered at halftime. And he is the same person who in the 48 hours before told the people asking about Omar Artan to chill and relax, and described the tournament as a total party. The gap between the language of the institution and the visible reality of the competition it is running has never been more literally embodied than it was on the night of the 11th of June 2026 in Guadalajara, Mexico. What is the bigger picture? The first 2 matches of this World Cup have given us 5 storylines that will define the tournament's character as it develops. The opener's red card chaos, 3 dismissals in the first match of the tournament's history, a record that speaks to the intensity and the pressure of the expanded 48-team format. Raúl Jiménez's tears, the most human moment of the first day, a story that transcends football and that will be shared and reshared for weeks. The empty seats and the jeering, the most uncomfortable moment of the first day, a visual confirmation of the attendance problem that months of data have been pointing toward. South Korea's second-half comeback, the football quality that can still emerge despite the surrounding noise, and the presence of FIFA's president in that Guadalajara stadium, watching the consequences of the tournament he built. But there is also a story from outside the stadiums that sits alongside all of this, and that has changed in the hours since the tournament opened. Omar Artan is in Mogadishu. UEFA has appointed him to the Super Cup final. In Salzburg in August, he will become the first African referee ever to lead a major UEFA final. The institution that runs European football stepped in with speed and conviction, where the institution that runs the World Cup offered nothing but an instruction to chill and relax. That contrast is now part of the permanent record of this tournament, alongside the goals and the red cards and the tears and the empty seats. What do you think? You've followed this sport for long enough to know that first impressions of a World Cup don't always hold. The 2002 tournament opened with the defending champions losing to Senegal. Nobody predicted that story would define the competition, but it did. The 2006 tournament opened with 6 goals between Germany and Costa Rica and told you immediately what that summer was going to feel like. What do the first 2 matches of 2026 tell you about the 6 weeks that follow? And here's the question that I think matters most. When Infantino sits in a stadium watching empty seats and players being jeered at halftime, and then goes back to his communications team and considers what to say next, does the evidence of those 2 nights change anything about how FIFA manages this tournament? Or does the machine simply continue, as it has throughout the build-up, with statements about unprecedented demand and total parties and the power of football to unite the world? If you found this worth your time, a like helps more than you'd think. Subscribe if you enjoy thoughtful football coverage, and let me know your view in the comments. I read every one. This story is still developing, and as always, football never stays quiet for long. See you in the next one.